Okay, so I want to give a very basic principle. And this is where the challenge comes from. Okay, the first basic principle is purely moral question. Would our morality override God's will, right? And although that sounds like a dilemma, actually philosophically it shouldn't be a dilemma at all, which actually creates a problem. The reason it's not a dilemma at all is because where does morality come from, right? Imagine God says, I'm the infinite being thinking you into existence, thinking your moral conscience into existence. It's all from me. Every moral thought you have is God's creation. And I'm telling you this is the right thing to do. So obviously that's a morally more compelling force than any emotion that God's given us. And therefore that would be the ultimate moral authority in the universe. The problem with that is that can be used as a justification for lots of people doing lots of things. And that's what actually makes it scary. What makes it scary is it's true. Because it's right that God's will comes above any other ethical principle, you can get lots of people killing in God's name or doing horrible things in God's name. And that makes you, have to be extremely sure. You have to have a very high epistemic threshold, a very high knowledge threshold before you do anything in the name of God that would appear to run against our ethical side. That's the first thing. And in fact, I'll tell you something, we didn't raise the topic here, but even wars, like even a war against Amalek, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a teshuvah, where even though the Torah says you have to eliminate whatever zecher Amalek means exactly, Nitziv says the Malchus, the kingship of Amalek, whatever exactly it is, you couldn't make a decision yourself to go to war and do it. You couldn't do it until a navi comes, that's what Rav Moshe says, and says, now God wants you to do this. Right? And you'd have to know they're a real navi, and you have to have done all the tests to prove that they're genuine, and only in that case can you actually go and do it. So that's a broad principle. But what I think the more important principles are that generally speaking, I think the big rule is that if you find there is a clash between what the Hashem tells us in Torah and our ethical intuitions, even though in theory Hashem can override any of them, in practice it will usually mean we haven't understood the Torah correctly, or we haven't understood ethics correctly. Okay? It's very similar to when science and Torah clashes. We've probably misunderstood one of them. And we can have examples of both of them. There is this third option, actually, which is we don't understand the circumstances correctly. Okay, so let's go through some of the examples you brought. So let's take Rivka's 3 years old. We know that the Torah doesn't like marrying 3-year-olds. How do we know that? The Gemara says in Kiddushin Daf Mem Aleph, you're not allowed to marry a woman until she's old enough, till she's mature, and old enough to say with this one I want and this one I don't want. Okay, so that's blanket prohibition. There you go. So how do we come up with the idea that Rivka might be 3 years old? It's a machlokas, not everyone agrees with it. But how do we come up with that idea? So it's based on, if you assume that we know that Yitzchak is 40 years old when he marries, we know that Yitzchak is 40 years old when he marries Rivka, right, that the Torah says. We know that how old he was when Sarah dies, because Sarah dies 127, and Yitzchak was born when she was 90. So there's 3 years between Sarah's death and his marriage to Rivka. Okay? At the same time, straight after the Akedah, you have two parashas, Rivka's birth, Sarah's death. So if you learn that all of them happen at the same time, that is to say, the Akedah happens, right? Avram's meant to offer up Yitzchak, the end of Parashat Vayera. Then when he hears the news that Rivka's been born, it's not that he heard that she was born a few years ago, that was the exact time she was born. And then Sarah dies straight away. If you put all those together, which Chazal do in some places, then you get the idea that Rivka is born 3 years before she gets married to Yitzchak. That's how it works out. Okay, that's where the number comes from. The Ibn Ezra says you don't need to agree with any of those. First of all, Avram could have heard the news that Rivka had been born years earlier. Just the news comes that Nachor's got this big family with 12 children, and it's good, right? You can also learn that Sarah dies afterwards. Right? You don't need to necessarily learn them all that way. And so, fine, so you got two approaches. One thing everybody agrees. The Torah describes Rivka as a na'ara. What is a na'ara? A fully mature girl, right? You have to be fully mature to be called a na'ara. she behaves like a Nara. She's carrying jugs of water down to the well. She's filling the well and feeding camels. 3-year-olds don't do things like that. She then talks to the Eliezer and says, yeah, come into our house. We've got lots of straw for you. That's not how 3-year-olds behave. Then when her father and brother say, yeah, you could marry her, but maybe she should stay, they say, well, let's consult with her what she wants to do. You don't do that with 3-year-olds, right? So she's clearly behaving like a fully mature girl in Torah. So either you're going to say, like Ibn Ezra, she is a fully mature girl, and you're going to read the Torah the way I described, or you're going to go with the other opinion that says she'd been in the world for 3 years, but she was in every way, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, exactly like a fully mature girl. So there's some miraculous, strange thing happening here, but there is no way that she is anything like a 3-year-old. Definitely she is physically mature, spiritually mature, emotionally mature, biologically mature, and yeah. There is one other possibility which Rashi seems to say, where he says that they didn't consummate the marriage until many years later. So you can actually have kiddushin in Jewish law, where you've done a marriage contract or given a ring or something, but you don't actually consummate the marriage till later. But so one thing is absolutely clear. There's no contradiction with that in the Gemara that says you can't marry a minor, because either there's some bizarre miracle and she's a major before having been in the world 3 years, or we just don't learn that way. Yeah, and nobody therefore tries to bring a halachic proof that there's any permission to marry somebody who's a minor from the story of Rivka. Yeah.
I don't know if this is right, but isn't Nara 12 years old? Or?
You have to be at least physically, 12 means the body has to be biologically mature enough to have a child, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
She was, if we say like she was fully matured, then I think Rashi said that they waited 10 years. So
Rashi seems to potentially have a third option, which is that the marriage contract, or even the giving the ring, what we'd call kiddushin, was done earlier, and nisuin, the actual living together, is done later. That's also a possible approach. One could take a third approach on that. Again, with Rashi, you'll still have to say there's something miraculous about her, because she's called Na'ara, and she doesn't behave like a 3-year-old. So everybody who's going to put the age of 3 in the story in Chayei Sarah is going to have to agree she's unusual. She doesn't talk like a 3-year-old. She talks like a mature adult. She doesn't behave like a 3-year-old, and she's physically much stronger than a 3-year-old, and so on. So everyone's going to agree with that. You are right that Rashi then says there's a waiting period anyway before any intercourse or any actual attempt to have a child. And so Rashi he's kind of marrying a few different things in there. The basic point is, if you're worried morally that the Torah is saying that a man can have physical relations with a woman at 3 years old, no, that's not correct, according to anybody. Yeah. By the way, I don't know if you saw, I had a video this week going through somebody attacking the Gemara, claiming that's what the Gemara says, amongst other things, and I showed them exactly why it's all a complete misreading of any Gemara. Yeah.
2 things. Doesn't Ksubis talk about a case where girl had relations before 3?
Yeah.
And also, are there any opinions that the units of years were different back then?
So I'll deal with the first question first, second question second. The Gemara does discuss in Ksubis, if God forbid a girl was raped under 3 years old, or over 3 years old. The Gemara does not condone that at all, okay? The Gemara is dealing with, in those days, look, when the Gemara speaks about the nations of the world around Israel at the days of the Talmud, the Gemara Mishnah, there were some pretty horrific practices that took place, right? The world has changed its value system very strongly in the last few thousand years. There was all sorts of horrific pagan rituals and stuff that took place, and the Gemara's got to deal with them. Also, the Gemara sometimes anyway deals with hypotheticals. And the question in Ksubis is this: suppose somebody converts from one of these pagan groups around us, where these are wild spread, and becomes Jewish. Our assumption is she's had a good chance she'd had some kind of sexual, what we'd call today, abuse done to her before. Now the question is, has she lost her virginity? For any halacha that virginity depends on virginity, do we assume she's lost it? And what the Gemara says, if it's under 3 years old, even if it might have been a horrendous, horrific act, we don't consider it a loss of virginity when she's older, because everything grows back in a way that we would say it's exactly the same as a virgin. Whereas if it's older than 3 years old, we would say she's lost her virginity. Okay? And forever, for example, marrying Cohen and so on. So that's going to be the only thing. The Gemara is absolutely not condoning it. The Gemara discusses also, the Gemara says, what happens if somebody kills somebody? It doesn't mean it condones it. The Gemara discusses loads and loads of situations and acts that are completely forbidden. There's the, what if it happened anyway? Now what happens? right? So that's the sort of Gemaras you'll see. And the Gemara does always draw a sharp distinction between under 3 and over 3 as to whether she's considered a virgin, and indeed whether the act is even considered a transfer of seed, etc., things like that. But it is certainly absolutely forbidden. In fact, the Gemara goes further, says any even quote-unquote consensual act, i.e. a seduction of a minor, is considered rape. It's Gemara in Yevamos. So you see the Gemara really is strongly against any relation with minors. Now you should know in those days people married in their teenage years. Right? It's relatively, we're one of the latest marrying societies in history because we spend a long time getting degrees in university until we eventually get a job. In the old days, people worked on farms, and the teenage kids were farmers already. They were out in the field, and people married in their teens and raised children. That's why you'll often see discussions about teenagers getting married in Torah. Right? That's was extremely common, both sides, male and female, and so on, but not minors. Okay, so let's talk about this issue, though, of slavery and then some of the other topics you raised as well, okay? Now, slavery is somewhat difficult because we look at slavery and we consider it very immoral, and for very good reasons, right? The idea of owning another human being, the idea, especially also, is very important that in the modern world we have a very strong what's called connotation. Every word has denotation, what it refers to, and connotation, what images it brings up. And the imagery of slavery nowadays is maybe 18th century slavery, 19th century slavery, 20th century slavery, and 21st century slavery. And the way that American slavery in particular worked is the strongest association with the work, which was an extremely abusive relationship, right? Okay, the word eved doesn't just mean slavery in that sense, because we talk about ourselves as avodim, servants of God. We don't mean slaves in the connotation that God is abusive to us, God forbid, right? So avdus means a state of servitude. Okay, now there's different types of servitude. The Torah says any citizen cannot be a permanent servant. That means anyone who's immigrated to your people, that includes immigrants, right? Gerim. If they join the people, they're part of the citizenry body of Israel, you're not actually allowed to keep a servant permanently. They can be temporary servants, eventually have to go free. If they are from the people who reject the law of the land completely, which is what Canaanites were, the people who are against the law of the land, then you can keep permanent servants according to the Gemara. But even then you can't abuse them, you can't mistreat them. If you hit them and they lose a limb or any damage permanent like that, then they go free. But much more than that, the Rambam sums up the Talmudic position at the end of the laws of Avodim and says that the way a servant would be is you'd never give them harsh work, you'd feed them before you feed yourself, because the Gemara says, Kana Eved, Kana Rabbi, acquiring a servant and treating them properly means you acquired a master, and so on. So why would you want one? For economic survival. And this gets the major point here. The major point is as follows. The Torah has laws for every single situation that will occur in history. Okay? The Torah is not just talking about the 21st century or 20th century or 19th century or 18th centuries. It's talking about the whole of human history. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And through most of human history, people were not as free as they are today. Today we have machines, which you don't realize, even before you got electronic machines, humans became a lot freer 300 years ago and 200 years ago with industrialization. For one thing, most of us don't need to farm anymore. Most of us are free to go and pursue jobs, move into cities, get much higher, if you like, income jobs and so on. We're free to have lots of spare time. We are much freer people than our great-great-grandparents were, and certainly our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were. They were not free in the way that we are. They probably were born in the same village that their parents were born. If they were Jews, they might have been expelled every so often. But if they weren't persecuted, they were born in the same village that their ancestors had lived. They farmed the same soil. They prayed every year there'd be enough grains to live, and that was 90% of everything they did. Okay, if they were women, they were having children all the time. They were constantly having babies and caring for those babies, and they probably died eventually in childbirth. That was the human condition. The reason servitude was important in the ancient world, as far as I know, there's no society that developed without some form of servitude. There are different forms, but some form of being able to conscript people so that they now function under your will as your worker. It could be at the local farm level. You have farm workers, because if the soil isn't fertile enough to produce crops, you need to know you've got a guy who together you'll work, and 2, 3 of you can produce a lot more than one of you can, and you can be very efficient economically. So you have that arrangement. Or in other countries like Britain, you had the feudal system where few landlords, basically everybody was a servant. Almost all people were born into some form of servitude. The landlord, the big land-owning servant, owned the area. The serfs basically worked for him. He let you on his land in as much as you worked for him and gave him all the stuff you gave. And then if you needed to go to war, you went to war with him. So everybody was a servant, right? The vast majority of people in a feudal system were servants of some form or another. So some form of servitude was probably necessary. The royalty wants to build something, they just commission people, conscript them, they don't have a will about it. So there was always some form of servitude in every society. Once industrialization came along and machines start to come in, suddenly it's possible to imagine a society where there's zero servitude. Suddenly all the things you needed a servant to do, a machine can do for you. Now we can ask a moral question: should we abolish all forms of servitude? That's a very good moral question. Now, does that mean that we become more moral than the Torah? So the Torah has to talk about times when you do need servants, as well as times when you don't. It clearly doesn't like the concept of servitude, because it tells you many times, you should see this. Again, we build a model Jewish people that eventually want everyone else to replicate, and within our society you can have servitude, but it has to be temporary. There has to be ways to end it always. And the reason is because I took you out of Egypt from the house of servitude, so that you'll be servants of God and not servants of anything else. That may apply first to us, but ultimately we want that to be a light to everybody. So that's the conceptual framework. Now people will say, oh, does that mean that we've become more moral than the Torah? No, we've got more technology than the times the Torah is speaking about. I'll give you an analogy, not an analogy, a real life example. In somewhere in the next few years or decades, we're going to probably end the killing of animals for meat. Why? Because we're going to lab produce meat that is as nutritious as animal meat or more, tastes as good or better, and is cheaper. Once it's even as cheap, as nutritious, and tastes as good as animal meat, why would we ever kill animals? Of course we're going to stop killing animals. Every society on earth will ban killing animals at some point. And then our grandchildren will turn to us and go, how did the Torah allow such a barbaric practice as killing animals? And what will the answer be? Because we didn't have lab-produced meat. And for most of human situation, you couldn't have subsisted without some kind of animal meat. So, in other words, the Torah talks about every situation. There are situations it hopes you'll eventually be able to get out of. But so long as you're in those situations, the Torah has to have a law for how to deal with them. Hopefully we're going to have peace one day. And then we'll turn around and go, what happened with war? Right? But the Torah has to tell you how to fight wars because they're horrible situations. The same with polygamy, by the way. The Torah doesn't seem to like it because apart from kings, no great people generally did them unless they had married somebody who can't have children. Then rather than divorce her, they take a second wife, marrying more than one wife. The Torah permits it, right? And then eventually the rabbis outlawed it. But what was going on there? And the very short answer seems to be that polygamy was a very important part of the ancient world. Why? Because suppose you went to war, for example, or there was a big famine, but especially war, because in a war the male population would be decimated, and now you had to repopulate, right? So what you did is every man married more than one wife. So the Torah has to allow the institution. It may not like it, calls it tsaros and so on. And then Rabbeinu Gershom turns around and goes, one sec, well, we're in exile now, there's no such thing as that. The populations are always in parity. If we're being persecuted, we're being persecuted equally. So he says we can't do it anymore. So that is, in other words, there's many examples where the Torah tells you how to deal with a situation that one day we will hopefully transcend. And there's a right, and we're limited. Look, as humans, we're limited. We've got death. The Torah talks about burial. We're going to have Tchias HaMesim one day. No one's going to die anymore. What was that about? The answer is, yes, we live in the post-Eden sin world full of the snake, of the poison of the snake. There's death, there's suffering, there's all sorts of problems in the world. And we have to work out how to be spiritual in every single situation.
Does that mean even for Karbanos?
Now, Karbanos is a different question. Officially we finished. Okay, let me say something about Karbanos. What are Karbanos? Offerings, right? Animal offerings. What's the purpose behind them? So the Ramban says that what's a korban? A korban is that we're in a constant battle every day of our life between our animal drives and our higher drives. All the time. Our animal drives want us to get angry. Our higher drives say no. Our animal drives tempt us, right? They're tempted. The animal drives have killing instinct in them. Animal drives have lustful instincts in them. Animal drives have laziness in them. Animal drives have possessiveness and jealousy in them. They're all part of our animal instincts, and we're genetically very similar to chimpanzee, and we've got a lot of the same brain states as a chimpanzee does, and we've also got higher drives that reflect neshama and godliness and so on. And we're constantly at war between them. When a person does a sin by certain types of sins, they are meant to bring the animal, and the animal's meant to represent them. And instead of getting punished bodily, the animal takes it for us, but it becomes us. And the idea in the Beis HaMikdash, and this is very important, the idea is not we just offer something to God so God's nice to us. That's not what they're ever brought for. The idea is that we bring this thing up, we do what's called smicha, where we physically connect to the animal, literally put our hands on its head. And at that moment, in the Beis HaMikdash, which was a place where you transcended the natural limits and boundaries, and were intensely aware of God's presence, you and the animal became one. It became the embodiment of all your animal drives. It's then shechted, so it loses its independent life, and it's then brought up to God on the altar. And that's meant to, if we're spiritually ready for it, be a radical transformation of our inner animal drives to become aligned with godliness forever. Hopefully a person will only have to do it once in their life. And that's the model behind what a korban is. Right? Is it horrible to watch an animal die for it? Yeah, but we understand that should have been us. Right? It's instead of us. So the principle is it's a radical rectification. Now, will we need it? So Rambam says something in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, where he says, there's lots of things we needed to wean ourselves off idolatry. For example, that's how they served idols with offerings, and so just like a mammal needs milk to be weaned off its mother, so too we needed to have these things when we came out of Egypt. The problem is the Rambam in Mishnah Torah is very clear that one of the few things he says Mashiach is going to do is restore the temple service. So Rav Kook has a piece where he says there'll be stages and phases, and you can understand so a few things on that. Number one is it's true that we need to be weaned off idolatry. But it's not true that we've matured and we don't do idolatry anymore. We don't do a certain type of idolatry, that's very true. The Torah has been extremely successful. It's hard for us to realize how successful it's been, that very few parts of the world still do anything that we would call absolute idolatry. You could argue about certain religions, do they, don't they? But certainly mainstream old school idolatry and pagan rituals, human sacrifices, all this kind of stuff are basically gone. And around us, we mainly live in worlds that are different types of monotheistic worlds, and certainly ethical monotheistic worlds and so on. So that's true. Our temptation in the Jewish people to turn to idols is not very strongly there. However, the Gemara says lots of things are really idol worship, like just ego, right? Gaiva is basically a root form of idolatry. So it seems that, and there's 51 mitzvahs in the Torah out of 613 that the Rambam classifies in the laws of idolatry. So there's a lot of stuff. Idolatry is not as simple as, that's it, you just bow to an idol, we've come away from that, right? You offered an animal, we've come away from it. It seems very plausible that we're constantly weaning ourselves off idolatry throughout history till the Messianic era. But you could say, okay, second point then is, in other words, it's still relevant to us. Look, Rambam davened Musaf. Okay, and in Musaf we daven for the return of the Avodah and the Beis HaMikdash. On the other hand, what you could say, and this is more the second point, is that most korbanos will be gone because most of the korbanos were sin offerings that the average person was bringing, and that may well go already at the beginning of the Messianic era. And others may then grow through the Messianic era as we move more and more towards the world to come. Then we may transcend the Beis HaMikdash being a single place, and the whole world becomes that. The world to come, we know everything's going to be different, and we'll be keeping Torah at a much deeper spiritual level anyway, and there's a Torah of the future. So yes, there may well come a point where the temple service becomes obviated. But nowadays, if you could do a service that would de-animalize you forever, it would be worth the loss of an animal for it.
Why don't you just burn money? Because that's like,
because you're not a money, you're an animal. You and I are animals, we're not money.
Yeah, but it's like kind of like idol worship, like nowadays.
Yeah, that may be true, but in the temple you didn't burn idols. The idea is not, we're not destroying bad things in the world. The animal which is being killed and then lifted to God is us. We are the animal. It's literally becoming an extension of us. And in that literal process, it's not just being killed and wasted, it's then being brought on the altar, meaning our animal drives lose their independent control over us, but we don't get rid of them altogether, we elevate them all to God. That's what the idea is of what the Beis Hamikdash and what the Korbanos are. And that's why we stop calling them Zevach, which means a sacrifice, and we start calling them Korban, which means an act of drawing near to God, once the book of Vayikra hits. There's still the word Zevach appears, but that becomes the main term. Okay, there was other stuff we wanted to get through, but I came late and I apologize, and that means we're out of time. So again, if you remind me next week of things we haven't finished, I do remember the stuff from last week they haven't finished as well. Hopefully this is some helpful things here.